Namo Ramana. A warm welcome to the Sunday Satsang with Raman Kendra Delhi. May I now request Narayananji at the shrine to initiate with Pran Pratishtha Puja, Updesh Saram, and Ashtotra. Narayananji.
Yes, yes. Om Chidaya Namaha. Namaha Namaha. Om Chidaya Namaha. Bhagavan Vishnu Chajivanam Jagabudam. Santavanam Jai Sarvabhuma Sante. I am the Samsar Bhagavan Bandhu. I am the Samsar Bhagavan. Tadeva Daganam Savinam Tadeva. Taravanam Savinam Tadeva. Vidyanam Devavanam Tadeva. Lakshmi Tadeva Devi Smaranam. Om Bhuva, Om Bhuva, Om Maha, Om Dana, Om Pala, Om Satyam, Om Tatsavayam, Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi, Dhiyo Yona Prachodayat, Om Avajyotita Amrutam Bhargoswaram, Amupata, Samasta, Buddha, Satvaram, Parmesha Priyatam, Karishamanasya Karma, Nirviran Pasatatamado, Vigna Gudam Karishe, Vityam Hirtulam Sulam Sandavam Deva, Pritvi Diya Tula Loka Deva Vishuna Tula, Lamsa Tareman Devi Vitram Gudatanam, Agamatam Tu Devanam Karnatam Tu Sata, Mandaram Karamyado Devavan Lanjanam, Amopata, Samasta, Buddha, Satara, Marmil Pitam, Buddha Siddham Madho Vigna Gudam Karishe, Garanam Bhagavatam Amame, Kalim Kalinam Namaskaram, Deshkarajan Brahmanam Brahmanaspade, Arusurum Sridharanam, Asmin Garitavate, Bhagavatim Jayami, Mahagavatim Avamehami. Om Mahagavatiye Namasamam Samarpayami, Om Mahagavatiye Namalyam Samarpayami, Om Mahagavatiye Namapadyam Samarpayami, Om Mahagavatiye Namasmanyam Samarpayami, Om Mahagavatiye Namamasari Prasadam Samarpayami, Om Mahagavatiye Namasanam Samarpayami, Om Mahagavatiye Namasakakam Akshadam Samarpayami, Om Mahagavatiye Namaha Yudnova Vidatam Akshadam Samarpayami, Om Mahagavatiye Namaha Ganga Dharayami Samarpayami, Om Mahagavatiye Namaha Gandhovati Akshadam Samarpayami, Om Mahagavatiye Namaha Alananatam Akshadam Samarpayami, Om Mahagavatiye Namaha Aditya Kumkumam Samarpayami, Om Mahagavatiye Namaha Pushpayami, Om Sudaya Namaha, Om Ekadantaya Namaha, Om Kapilaya Namaha, Om Gayadantaya Namaha, Om Nampuraya Namaha, Om Vikaraya Namaha, Om Vikarajaya Namaha, Om Vinayakaya Namaha, Om Dhumadevave Namaha, Om Ganasakshaya Namaha, Om Balachadraya Namaha, Om Gajananaya Namaha, Om Makramundaya Namaha, Om Surpakarnaya Namaha, Om Hirambaya Namaha, Om Skandabudvaya Namaha, Om Siddhavinayagare Namaha, Om Shankara Mokshara Vinayagare Namaha, Om Atupurapane Vinayagare Namaha, Om Mahagavatiye Namaha, Nana Parvamatra Pushpani Samarpayami, Dhupartam समर्पयामि अक्षतां समर्पयामि ओम भूर्भुवस्सुः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात् तेन सवितुर्वरेण्यं प्रचोदयामि अमृतं स्वाहा ज्ञानाय स्वाहा महाय स्वाहा ज्ञानाय स्वाहा वरदाय स्वाहा ओम समानाय स्वाहा ब्रह्मणे स्वाहा महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः कर्कटविद्युं समर्पयामि दीपावलिं समर्पयामि अमृतं पुत्रवसं समर्पयामि कर्पूरं समर्पयामि महागणपतिये नमः कर्पूरं समर्पयामि नीराजनं समर्पयामि नीराजनम् आसनीयं समर्पयामि ओम 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 स्वाहा 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 महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः वक्रतुंड महाकाय सूर्यकोटि समप्रभ सर्वकार्येषु सर्वदा नमस्कारं सत्ता प्रणामी ओम ओम मूल ओम स्व ओम नमः ओम जनानंद ओम सत्यम ओम तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात् ओम ज्योतिर्गर्भपूर्वोत्तरात् नमोपाता नमस्कार दुर्गा जयकारा की परमेश्वर उच्चतम सुबह सोमने मुक्ते आप भी ब्रह्मण इनके प्राप्ते ऋग्वेदे वराह धर्मे वैवस्वत ब्रह्मण करे अष्टावंश तुदमे कलियुगे तुदमे भागे जम्मू द्वीपे भारतवर्षे भरतखंडे नीरो दक्षिणे पार्श्वे तलास्ते अस्मिन् वर्तमाने यावावृते ब्रह्मादिनां तस्मिन् संवत्सराणां मध्ये विलवनाम संवत्सरे दक्षिणायने वर्षऋतु सिंहमासे कृष्णपक्षे सप्तमीतिथ्यां सुभजितो भानुवासरयुक्तायां कृत्तिकानक्षत्रयुक्तायां शुभनक्षत्र शुभयोग शुभकर्ण देवगुण विशेषण विशिष्टायां अस्यां सप्तमीतिथ्यां सुभजितो मम जन्मपत्रनि जन्मलिंगं मध्ये सर्वाधानं सर्वेषां पापानां सत्यावगमनार्थम् अस्माहं सहकुर्माणं क्षेमसद्धिर्य वीर्यविद्य आयुरारोग्य ऐश्वर्यम् अभिवृद्धिं समस्तमङ्गलाभ्यर्थं समस्तदुर्योगशाभ्यर्थं रमणवंशीय प्राणेन ज्ञानवैराग्यसिद्ध्यर्थं रमणवंशीये पूजां करिष्ये सर्वं पूजां स करिष्ये विघ्नेश्वरं निवासस्थानं प्रतिष्ठापयामि शोभनार्थे क्षेमाय पुनरागमनाय च कलशस्य मुखे विष्णुवर्गेण च समायुक्तः मूलिकप्रतिष्ठितो ब्रह्मा कुशोत्तरा सर्वे सर्वशिवावसुमरा ऋग्वेदो यजुर्वेदो सामवेदोत्तरवर्ण गंगे सततम गोदावरी सरस्वती नर्मदे सिंधु कावेरी जलेस्मिन् सन्निधिं कुरु अन्ये सैका सर्वे उत्तम समाचिता आयातु देव पूजनं दुर्दशकारगा अम्बुरा सागरपन्नो विष्णुकरे देवस्य पूज्ये पुनीत अंजलि नमोस्तुते देवो देवाय पुत्र जीव देवस्वान अंजलि स्वयं भवने पूजे ओम सकलगुणात्मकाय योगिराजने नमः आधार शक्तिये नमः मूल प्रगतिये नमः आदिवराय नमः आदिगुरुवाय नमः अनंताय नमः लक्ष्मीये नमः आदित्यादि नवग्रह देवताभ्यो नमः जगज्जनपालिभ्यो नमः गुरुब्रह्मा देवो महेश्वरा गुरु साक्षात् परब्रह्म तस्मै श्री गुरवे नमः। ओम अस्य श्री प्राणप्रतिष्ठामन्त्रस्य ब्रह्मा विष्णु महेश्वरा ऋषि सामदर्वाणि संतांसि सकल जगत् सम्मानदान प्राणशक्ति परादेवता आम बीजम हरि शक्ति रोम कीलकम प्राण प्रतिष्ठापने विनियोगार आम पुष्पावरण हरि दर्जन ज्ञानमय ओम मध्यमाभ्यां नमः आम अनाभ्यां नमः हरि नमस्ताभ्यां नमः ओम प्रतिष्ठाभ्यां नमः आम विद्याय नमः हरि सत्य स्वाहा ओम शिवाय नमः आम कौसाय हरि नेत्रदाय औषध ओम मस्तकाय पूर्व सर्व दिग्बंध ज्ञानम कर्ताम मध्यस्थ बोधो रस कर्म कराचे वासम बोधनम विष्णु पंचमाना विज्ञान सुखपाल जिने सुधा जोया देवी बारा दोना बहुत काम कराना ओम हरि ओम ओम हरि माम अम्यं रंगं ओम सब संभ हम सो सोम से अस्याम तो जीवन जिष्टु अस्यामूर्तौ सर्वेन्द्रियाणि वाङ्मनस्सत्सत्र दिव्या प्राणवाक् आनिवाद आयुस्तानि या कस्ति स्वस्ति सुरं सुरं दृष्टन्तु स्वाहा ओम अस्ति श्री प्राणप्रतिष्ठामन्त्रस्य ब्रह्मा विष्णु महेश्वरा ऋषिरिति सामधर्माणि संतांसि सृष्टिलि सम्मार्गाणि प्राणशक्ति परादेवता आम बीजम हरिं शक्ति ओम कीलकम प्राण प्रतिष्ठापने विनियोग आम अनुष्ठाभ्यां नमः हरि दर्शनाभ्यां नमः ओम मध्यमाभ्यां नमः आम अनाभ्यां नमः हरि नमस्ताभ्यां नमः ओम कर्मष्टाभ्यां नमः आम विद्याय नमः हरि सिद्धे स्वाहा ओम सिद्धाय वसत् आम कौसायम हरि नेत्रदाय वसत् पूर्व सर्व दिग्बंध असुनीदे गुणस्मात् सक्सपुन प्राणने नो देवोगम योपस्य सूर्य मुचन्न मनोरे मर्याद शक्ति आवायुदो भव सद्दायुदो भव सन्निधो भव सन्निधो भव अवगुणिदो भव सुभृतो भव सुभृसन्नो भव सुमुखो भव वरदो भव प्रसिद्ध प्रसिद्ध स्वामी सर्वजगन्नाथ यावत् पूजावसानकं तावत् भवद्विभावेन बिम्बेऽस्मिन् सन्निधं गुरो ओम नमो भगवते श्री कुशेलाय नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री कुबेराय नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री कुशेलाय नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री कुबेराय नमः चतुर्मुखमंडलेन पौरुषे संकल्पः लक्ष्मीपुर श्रीमानंद यदीश्वरा साइड भगवान सर्वस्तोत्र श्री गुरुभ्यो नमः गुरु ब्रह्मा गुरु विष्णु गुरुदेवो महेश्वरा गुरु साक्षात् परब्रह्म तस्मै श्री गुरवे नमः अपारतत्व विद्वान् दासोऽयशोन्मात्रं पूर्णं समस्तं नायिदं चन्द्रमं कबीरं चिन्ताविनं हृदि चिन्तयामि ॐ नमो जाताय नमः ॐ श्री रमणाय नमः ॐ गुरवे नमः ॐ अगण्यसंविदाधराय नमः ॐ महोदसे नमः ॐ कारणोद्भवाय नमः ॐ जगत्पितावताराय नमः ॐ श्री भूमिनाथास्तुलोचिताय नमः ॐ पराशरगुणोतंसाय नमः ॐ सुन्दराचलपदाय नमः ॐ कमनीयसुचारित्राय नमः ॐ सयाम्बासयायवते नमः ॐ शोणाकुलमहोलीनमानसाय नमः ॐ स्वर्णाष्टकाय नमः ॐ श्रीमद्भागवतान्धमहास्त्रेणविद्योदयाय नमः ॐ महाशक्तिभावेन प्रयुक्ताय नमः ॐ परमार्थविदे नमः ॐ गिरिराय नमः ॐ पितृगान्वेषणे नमः ॐ हिन्दुमौलिना पितृमुदे नमः ॐ विग्रादेश्च सोमशैलं प्राप्ताय नमः ॐ तमोमयाय नमः ॐ उदासीनाय नमः ॐ महायोगिने नमः ॐ नमोत्सहाय नमः ॐ कुशाग्रदिये नमः ॐ शान्तसंकल्पसम्भवाय नमः ॐ सुसुन्दे नमः ॐ सवित्रे नमः ॐ स्थिराय नमः ॐ तवशरीरसर्वङ्गाय नमः ॐ पुल्लाम्बोजतिलोचनाय नमः ॐ चन्द्रिकासुदास श्रीमन्दिराय मण्डलाय नमः ॐ सूदवाच्यां समासीनाय नमः ॐ सूर्यदात्रे Namaskaramakamaaya Namaha. Om Veda Vedanta Tattvaඥāya Namaha. Om Chimutrane Namaha. Om Tribhunadhanaya Namaha. Om Nirupaksha Muvavasaya Namaha. Om Nirajata Sarvakadiye Namaha. Om Chittanayanaya Namaha. Om Purnaya Namaha. Om Nasidasvatandavaya Namaha. Om Gambhiraya Namaha. Om Paramacharyaaya Namaha. Om Suprasanjaya Namaha. Om Abhyapradaya Namaha. Om Dakshināsindhaya Namaha. Om Dhīraya Namaha. Om Dakshinābhimukāya Namaha. Om Swaraje Namaha. Om Maharshye Namaha. Om Bhagavate Namaha. Om Vidyaya Namaha. Om Bhumavidyavisāradaya Namaha. Om Nivalaya Namaha. Om Dirghadarsane Namaha. Om Aptaya Namaha. Om Nijamatra-Pradasakaya Namaha. Om Samatuse Namaha. Om Satyatuse Namaha. Om Satyaya Namaha. Om Prasadaya Namaha. Om Amravikramaya Namaha. Om Sukumaraya Namaha. Om Sadanandaya Namaha. Om Durvasane Namaha. Om Dayanavaya Namaha. Om Shri Sonasuri Guru Skandasam Vedaraya Namaha. Om Saddharsanavadeshware Namaha. Om Saddharsanavadeshware Namaha. Om Ganeshamurtindene Siddhamurtindaya Namaha. Om Gitodesasarādivakasam Namaha. Om Varnāsamudātīdāya Namaha. Om Jasagdāya Namaha. Om Saubhavyāya Namaha. Om Mahatmavade Namaha. Om Sarvabandhusthānām Ārāധ്याय Namaha. Om Sarvasatgurave Namaha. Om Atmāramaya Namaha. Om Mahabhagāya Namaha. Om Matrumuktividāya Namaha. Om Vinataya Namaha. Om Virudaya Namaha. Om Vipraya Namaha. Om Mundraya Namaha. Om Bhavagodvaraya Namaha. Om Darshanādharasamārne Namaha. Om Maunirasvakambodhāya Namaha. Om Chandradarshādityaya Namaha. Om Pranādbandhamochakāya Namaha. Om Andasminasandāmsave Namaha. Om Samsāranamatarakāya Namaha. Om Sonādhikudishware Namaha. Om Atmavidyaprakaṣakāya Namaha. Om Avichudaniyapraknāya Namaha. Om Naisargiya Mahapurushe Namaha. Om Kapandakulaaya Namaha. Om Suprabhavinavasanaaya Namaha. Om Guhāya Namaha. Om Dandavāniye Namaha. Om Kripakurunāya Namaha. Om Bhagavadvapishambharaaya Namaha. Om Skandāya Namaha. Om Devatamaaya Namaha. Om Amartayāya Namaha. Om Senāniye Namaha. Om Purushottamāya Namaha. Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Raghunath Shri Raghunaya Namaha. Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Raghunath Shri Raghunaya Namaha. Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Raghunath Shri Raghunaya Namaha. Namo Bhagavate Shri Kartikeya Namaha. Namo Bhagavate Shri Buddhaya Namaha. Namo Bhagavate Shri Vallidevaya Namaha. Namo Bhagavate Shri Subramanyaya Namaha. Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Swaminarayanaya Namaha. Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Dakshinamurtiye Namaha. Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Nataraja Namaha. Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Bhairavaya Namaha. Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Nandimaheswaraya Namaha. Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Shivaparvatiye Namaha. Om Namah Shivaya 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 Namaha. Om Shivaya Namaha. Om Shivaya Namaha. Om Shivaya Namaha. Chidanandarupam Shivoham Shivoham. Shivoham Shivoham Chidanandarupam. Chidanandarupam Shivoham Shivoham. Shivoham Shivoham Chidanandarupam. Chidanandarupam Shivoham Shivoham. Shivoham Shivoham Chidanandarupam. Now let us all recite Upadesa Sara. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Deva Maheshwara. Guru Sakshat Parabrahma. Tasmai Gurave Namaha. Duragaya Napade Param Karma Kimbaram Karma Kriti Mahadada Vadanakaram Vayanasaspadam Yadinyodaram Isvarakitam Nechayadudam Ittadodaram कायवामन कार्यमुद्गमं नूतनं जवन्दनं कर जगतैषधी युद्धसेवनम् अष्टमूर्तिः देवभूषणम् रुद्रवस्तवा रुद्रमन्यत सिद्धजं जप ज्ञानमुत्तमम् आद्यधारया षोडशासनं शरणचिन्तनं विरहभरणं वेदभावना सौवमित्यसो भावनाभिधा भावनीमदा भावशून्यस भावसुस्तुति भावनाबला भक्तियुक्तम ईश्वरे मना स्वस्थता क्रिया भक्तियोग योगासनस्थितम् आदियोगना क्रियते मन जालभक्षुव योगसाधनम् चित्तवायव विक्रियायुगा सागयोद्वयी शक्तिमूलगा जयविनाशने उभयरोदने लयकदम्बुना भवदिनोऽमृतम् पुराणवन्दना दीनमानसम् वेगचिन्तना नासमेत्यद अष्टमानतो कृष्णयोगिन नित्यमस्तिभिः स्वस्तिरप्यत दृश्यमानिदं सिद्धमात्मना चित्वदर्शनं तत्त्वदर्शनं मानसं हृदिं मानमे हृदे दैवमानसं मार्गार्जवा हृदयस्वं वृद्धिमाश्रिता हृदयो मनो नित्यहं आमयं पुरो भवति चिन्वद ऐमदग्रहं निजविचारणम् अहं विनाशवान् अहममुद्रय सुरवीरस्वयं परमपूर्णः इदमहं वदा अनित्यमद्वहम् अहं दीनकी अभ्यर्थसत्तय विक्रये प्रिय प्राणदीपम नाम से कस गंजन सस सत्ववासिना विश्ववेदना सद्दयायति सिद्धयालहम् ईशजीवयो येषजीविता सस्वभावदो वस्तुदेवरम् येषानन्द स्वात्मदर्शनम् ईशदर्शनम् स्वात्मरूपतया आत्मसंस्कृति स्वात्मदर्शनम् आत्मनिर्भया आत्मनिष्ठा ज्ञानवर्धिता अज्ञानदीनते ज्ञानमस्ति ज्ञानमन्तर किं स्वरूपमे आत्मदर्शने अव्ययाभवा अपूर्णसि सुगम् वन्दं यदि सम्भरं सुरम् लिङ्गदीयै वस्तुदैविद अहमवेदकं निजनिवानकं महतिकं तपो रमणवादियं महतिकं तपो रमणवादियं महतिकं तपो रमणवादियम् ओम नमो भगवते श्री रघुनाथ श्री रमणाय नमः 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 ओम नमो भगवते श्री रघुनाथ श्री रमणाय Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Raghav Kumar. 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 Hari Om. Hari Om. Hari Om. Hari Om. Hari Om. Hari Om.
Namo Ramana. A warm welcome once again to our Sunday Satsang, where we study Bhagavan's 42 chosen verses from Bhagavad Gita. Our speaker, like last time, is Sh Raghav Kumar ji, a long-time devotee of Bhagavan and resident near the ashram. A brief background about him. Raghav Kumarji is a devotee of Bhagavan Ramana Maharishi with a background of Vedanta study under various acharyas of Rishikesh and Uttarakashi over several years. After completing a degree in technology in 1993 and a few years of research in electronics, he was drawn to the exclusive pursuit of the path of self-inquiry. Raghav Kumarji was blessed to be closely associated with the Ramakrishna mission, Arshavidya tradition, and the Adi Shankara Brahma Vidyapith, Uttarkashi. Since 2001, he divides his time between Uttarkashi and Thiruvannamalai. He occasionally shares what he has learned from the acharyas with fellow devotees. Raghavji, may I please request you to start to address the devotees and take the conversation further.
Namaste and a warm welcome. Thank you, Anuragji, for organizing these satsangs based on Bhagavan's selected verses from the Gita. We will commence with the Shanti Mantra and Bhagavan's Mangala Shasanam. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Ishvaro Gururatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavadvyapta Dehaya Dakshinamurtaye Namaha. Vande Shri Ramanashehe Acharyasya Padabjam Yo me Darshayadisham Dhantam Dhantamatītya. So during the last session, we had seen a brief introduction to Bhagavan's Gita Saraha, which consists of 42 selected verses of the Bhagavad Gita. We will spend a little while reviewing what we had studied during the last session. The Gita is considered rightly the essence of all the Vedas. Sri Shankara has called it the Vedartha Sarasangraha Bhutam. It's the essence of the entire collection of Vedic mantras. And Bhagavan has further summarized it into a short compass of 42 shlokas, which is why this selection, the Gita Saraha of Bhagavan, has been called Sarasya Saram. It is the essence of the very essence of the Vedas. Bhagavan has also composed a Mangala Shasanam, which we will chant. पार्थसारथिरूपेण श्रावयित्वा शुभां गिरम् पार्थस्यार्तिहरो देवः कृपामूर्तिः स पातु नः पार्थसारथिरूपेण श्रावयित्वा शुभां गिरम् पार्थस्यार्तिहरो देवः कृपामूर्तिः स पातु नः. Bhagavan, in his translation of the Dakshinamurti Stotram, has said that the same Shankara who has composed the Dakshinamurti Stotram is also present in his very heart. Sunnavat Shankaran Tunnuvennule. That was Bhagavan's statement. And so there is no difference at all in the vision of Shankara and Bhagavan. In that spirit, we study these verses of the Bhagavad Gita. Now, the Gita commences at the very start with a very high level of discussion about Atma instead of giving many intermediate steps. And it is not surprising that Bhagavan too has done likewise by selecting the verses which are directly unfolding the unity between the Jiva and Ishvara. So he doesn't mention Karma Yoga initially, instead taking after Krishna, as it were, Bhagavan to takes the disciple to a much higher level and unfolds the unity between the Jiva and the Ishvara. This is what we had seen in the last session. I also mentioned that the Guru's words are not just lectures. Instead, they have the capacity to put the disciple's mind in the state of self-inquiry. And it is in that spirit that we approach this study of the Gita, that the mind is helped to resolve into itself by the very hearing and dwelling upon the words of the Guru. And this process where the disciple's mind resonates with the Guru is a very great blessing. It happens in a very restricted and a very difficult context where the Sishya or the disciple is very open to the Guru's teaching. We have a well-known verse in the Shastra called Shabdajalam Maharanyam Chitta Brahmanakarakam. The words of the Shastras are many and they can just confuse the mind. They are like a forest in which you can lose your way. And yet, by listening and carefully dwelling upon the words of the Guru, we get the key to the Shastra. We get the key to understanding and applying that Shastra in one's own understanding. In the case of the Gita, this particular aspect should be borne in mind, that it is not an intellectual study. Rather, Gita is a moksha shastra. In other words, the shlokas of the Gita are designed with the intention of directly revealing the truth. They are known as pratipadaka shlokas. Pratipadana means to directly unfold the truth about oneself. And Bhagavan's Upadeshas too are in that same category. They are not at all an intellectual study, which is why we should be careful when we see this dialectic, where Shastra on the other one hand has many arguments and many concepts. At the same time, when we receive it through the words of the Guru, then alone that Shastra blesses us and we are able to assimilate that vision of Advaita through the Guru's Upadesha. So in this Mangala Shasanam shloka, Bhagavan also indicates the nature of the Shishya, Parthasya Arti Haraha, indicating that the Shishya has recognition of his helplessness, of his distress. If the Shishya is like a full vessel, as it were, then the Guru's words cannot reach deep inside the disciple. So there is a certain helplessness and surrender on the part of the disciple. That's when the Guru's words will take effect. We should also remember that the Jnani or the Guru here has no need to really teach anything, which is why it is the Guru who invokes it is the Shishya who invokes the Guru's grace, saying, Madartham Smara, for my sake, O Guru, please recollect the words of the Shastra, which you no longer need, but for my sake, please guide and instruct me. So it's only for the sake of that very open, receptive disciple that the Guru starts teaching. And in the Mangala Shasanam, we also saw that Bhagavan uses the word Shubham Giram. Shubha is Mangala Suchaka. It is a sign of auspiciousness. And the most auspicious thing that is what is known as the complete removal of sorrow, the absolute removal of sorrow. Whenever there is any distress, there are many ways to try and deal with that sorrow. All those methods, however, are temporary, and sorrow is a recurring occurrence in the jiva's life. On the other hand, when the Guru's Upadesha takes effect in the Shishya's mind, it leads the Shishya towards what we call Atyantika Dukkha Nivritti, the total cessation of sorrow. By taking the Shishya to beyond this temporal realm, where he is able to own up his own nature as non-dual, as Advaita. So that is the Shubham Giram. It is the most auspicious speech or narration of the Guru. So after this Mangala Shasanam, we also saw that although Bhagavan is trying to very briefly summarize the Gita, he has nevertheless included to provide context the shloka where Arjuna expresses or Sanjaya expresses Arjuna's helplessness. So we'll read that shloka. Sanjaya uvacha tantata kripaya vishtam ashruporna kulekshanam vishidantamidam vakyam uvacha madhusudanaha tantata kripaya vishtam ashruporna kulekshanam vishidantamidam vakyam uvacha madhusudanaha. And I'd also mentioned that although this is such a small corpus of shlokas, Bhagavan nevertheless chooses to include this particular shloka, which seems to be more peripheral really to the teaching of the Gita. And that is because it is so important to have that Shishya in that frame of mind where he is no longer ready for any diversions, any distractions, any palliatives as they're called. He is now a mumukshu. What is a mumukshu? A mumukshu seeks a permanent solution to his problem, which is why the acharyas tell us that it is a sign of grace when our distress, a situation that causes distress, is converted into an opportunity. All human beings face distress, and a few who have the grace of God, the grace of the Guru, convert that very distress into what we call an existential crisis. So we try to inquire deeper. We are no longer satisfied with temporary solutions. And here Arjuna was in that frame of mind. I had mentioned that Krishna and Arjuna had known each other for several decades, and yet they had never apparently conversed on Vedanta. That indicates that it's very important for this disciple to become a mumukshu, one who seeks freedom from sorrow. One of the meanings of the word moksha is, of course, freedom from what is known as the cycle of births and rebirths. But our acharyas tell us that a better meaning of the word moksha is freedom, absolute freedom from sorrow or distress of any kind. Because births and deaths, only if they're sorrowful, need to be dealt with. To take an example, Krishna was an avatar or a jnani. He does not have any problem with the mere fact of birth. It is said that Vedavyasa had been in his earlier incarnation or earlier birth, a great rishi called Dirghatamas. And such births were there even for these rishis, indicating that for them it's not a source of distress, which is why the correct or more accurate meaning of the word moksha is freedom from sorrow, freedom from distress. And so now Arjuna had converted his sorrowful situation where he had to be violent towards his relatives into an opportunity to surrender to Krishna, his guru. He had converted, in one word, a topical problem into an existential opportunity, meaning a simple, localized sorrow is now taken as a tool to inquire deeper into the very source of all distress, which was a sign of grace upon Arjuna. Now we will go to the second shloka. As I mentioned, both Bhagavan and Krishna Bhagavan also start off on a very high note. There was a conversation which I quoted where a disciple asks Bhagavan, doesn't the Gita talk of graded paths, lokesmin vividhanishta, pura prokta mayanaga, jnana yogena sankhyanam, karma yogena yoginam? In other words, you first do practice of karma yoga, and by slowly you come to the practice of self knowledge. This kind of steady and slow gradation is there, isn't that true? And then Bhagavan answers, didn't Krishna start with Samkhya Yoga? Krishna commenced the very teaching with the highest Sankhya Yoga. He gave Arjuna knowledge before then instructing him to do his duty in an unselfish or in a nishkamya manner. And which is why Bhagavan was never too fussy in some sense about trying to tell people you're not ready for self-inquiry. He would never say that. He would always say anyone can practice self-inquiry. It's the most direct and accessible path. And then we saw that when the disciples express their inability or their lack of progress in their own perception and they wish to take up some other methods, Bhagavan fully accepts and validates that. And I'd also mentioned how the Kena Upanishad too has a similar flow where the Guru gives the highest teaching first. The Guru will never underestimate the disciple. He believes that the disciple is capable of the direct highest knowledge right away. And after listening to the entire Upanishad, the Sishya, there, one of the Sishyas there tells the Guru in the Kena Upanishad, hey Guru, please instruct me in the Upanishad, indicating he had not grasped it. Then the Guru mentions yajna and karma and so on. So, hello? Yeah. So that is the spirit in which this shloka of the Bhagavad Gita commences with the 13th chapter. I had mentioned that the Bhagavad Gita has 18 adhyayas or chapters. The first 6 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita deal with what is known as the Tvampada Vichara. In Vedanta, we have the Mahavakya Tat Tvam Asi. Tat is that, or Ishvara, or Brahman. Tvam is you, the individual, and Asi establishes identity. You are that. That you are, to put it in the correct sequence. And in the Bhagavad Gita, the first 6 of the 18 adhyayas deal with the individual. The next 6 deal with the cosmic being Ishvara, Krishna as the cosmic being, the Virat Purusha. And finally, the last 6 deal with the identity. How do we know our oneness and be there with that knowledge of oneness with Ishvara, which is our own Swarupa? And Bhagavan chooses that very 13th chapter shlokas to commence his selected verses from the Gita. We will chant the first 2 shlokas in the sequence. The 13th chapter, first and second shlokas are Bhagavan's choice in this selection. Shri Bhagavan idam shariram kaunteya kshetramitya vidiyate एतद् यो वेत्ति तं प्राहुः क्षेत्रज्ञ इति तद्विदः इदं शरीरं कौन्तेय क्षेत्रमित्यभिधीयते एतद् यो वेत्ति तं प्राहुः क्षेत्रज्ञ इति तद्विदः. So this shloka directly takes Arjuna to that perspective that all that the jiva, you or I experience, is known as kshetra. Kshetra primarily refers to the body. Idam shariram kaunteya. This sharira, O kaunteya, is known as the kshetra. And the one who knows this kshetra, one who objectifies it, that locus of consciousness in each jiva is known as kshetrajna. So initially, we can say that there is a witness who is witnessing this body from within, and that is known as the kshetrajna. Kshetram janati iti kshetrajna. And the kshetra word itself, Sri Shankara explains by saying that karma phala nivrittehe, it is known as kshetra. For the sake of fulfilling the seeds or fruits of karma, it is known as kshetra. Just as in any field, you sow seeds and after that you get a tree and then you get fruits from the tree. Even so, this sharira is the kshetra or field, literally field. But why is it the field? Because that is where we experience the fruits of karma, the fruits of our past actions. That is why it is called kshetra. And then the kshetrajna is the one who witnesses, who knows the kshetra from within. So, like I said, the next shloka in this sequence, commencing the Asipada Vichara, the Aikyam, the oneness between the individual soul and Ishvara. Now we will chant it. Kshetrajnam chapi mam vidhi sarvakshetreshu bharata kshetrakshetrajnayor jnanam yattadjnanam matam mama क्षेत्रज्ञं चापि मां विद्धि सर्वक्षेत्रेषु भारत क्षेत्रक्षेत्रज्ञयोर्ज्ञानं यत्तज्ज्ञानं मतं मम. So here Bhagavan is saying that I am the kshetrajna in all the kshetras. In other words, I am that consciousness which is present, as it were, in all the kshetras. Truly speaking, consciousness is not present in the body. However, to start with, we say that it is, as it were, present in the body and is experienced as the very I. And are there many such consciousnesses? No. Consciousness is a singular word. There is no plural for the word consciousness. The Kshetrajna is just one. That is what Sri Krishna Bhagavan is saying here. Sarva Kshetreshu, in all these Kshetras, I am that one consciousness. And the real nature of that consciousness, Sri Shankara explains, is Nirasta Sarvopadhi. All the upadhis, the incidental superimpositions are negated, which is why consciousness in its own nature doesn't have any association really with anything other than itself. It is in its own mahima, sve mahimni tishtati. It rests in its own glory. And yet, our starting point of inquiry is as if we are in the body, as if we are experiencing various objects. So we have to start from there and then take it within, take it to a higher understanding. So these two shlokas expressing the basic duality of matter and consciousness are like a springboard which unfold the Advaita Jnana. I had also mentioned that the word kshetra implies that which decays, that which is subject to destruction. And I had mentioned that it's not a surprise that modern science has discovered that one of the fundamental laws of nature is that as time passes, anything that is put together will fall apart. That is known as the law of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, as they call it, where anything that is intelligently put together will, after some time, decay. Therefore, all that is called kshetra is subject to that law of entropy. It decays. There is disorder after a while. But consciousness is not subject to entropy. It never decays. It is ever pure, ever whole, and indestructible. So this duality is initially postulated, where all that is kshetra falls apart. It is subject to ksharanam or destruction. So the law of entropy I had mentioned because it is so fundamental that even the flow of time is governed by this law of entropy. Things, systems move from orderliness to disorder. That is the flow of time. You never see things put back together in an orderly way unless there is an intelligent being. Things tend to get more disorderly as time passes. That is the basic law here. The kshetra is subject to that law. And I also mentioned that Bhagavan says that when Krishna says, I am the kshetrajna in all the kshetras, that includes even so called inanimate objects like stones or trees. And he says that you can look at a stone like a sleeping man. Just because you call out to a sleeping man and he does not wake up, that does not mean, Bhagavan says, that does not mean that there is no consciousness there. He's just asleep. Even so, we can, so to speak, say consciousness is sleeping in a sense in a stone and it is awake in a human being. And Bhagavan also mentioned that you can look at the upadhi of a tree, for example. A tree is like a standing man, and a man is a moving tree. He poetically puts it like that, saying that you can look at a tree like a man who is standing. He does not have a capacity to move around, but the same consciousness is present even in a tree. It's a little more active than in a stone. The way we explain this is through this idea that the same consciousness is manifest to a different degree in different upadhis. The upadhi is like the shell or what is superimposed on consciousness. And in stones, that consciousness is only available as existence. The stone exists. That's the only statement of its manifestation. On the other hand, in an animal, there is also existence and some knowledge. The animal can interact with human beings. That is why we keep pets. We are able to have some loving interaction with these pets because they have chit. Also, they are not just existence, but there is some knowledge, some lived experience with animals. And then when it comes to a human being, the aspect of ananda or happiness without any boundedness, that is also a possibility. So ananda means freedom from all limitations. So in the case of a stone, you have only the sat aspect in that kshetra. In the case of animals, you have sat and chit, maybe a little partial manifestation of ananda. But in a human being, the potential of consciousness to manifest itself fully is all present only in a human being. That is why a human body is regarded as a great gift of Ishvara, where the entire manifestation of jnana can happen. The purna jnana can happen in a human embodiment. There are a few rare and extraordinary exceptions like Lakshmi the cow, where Bhagavan showed his grace to her and conveyed the jnana to her as well. But by and large, only human beings have this capacity to strive for self-knowledge. So these different upadhis are present, is what Bhagavan says. And in the next shloka, which was Bhagavan's choice for the most succinct and quintessential shloka of the Gita, where the verse actually says that I am that self who is present in the heart of all living beings. I am the beginning, the middle, and the end of all these beings. That is the shloka which Bhagavan chose as the one shloka from the Gita, which is the succinct summary of the entire Gita. It is in the 10th chapter, the 20th shloka. We will chant that now. Ahamatma Gudakesha Sarvabhutashayassthitah Ahamaदिश्च मध्यं च भूतानामन्त एव च अहमात्मा गुडाकेश सर्वभूताशयस्थितः अहमादिश्च मध्यं च भूतानामन्त एव च. So this shloka is given understandably a lot of importance because this has in its first half the identity of the individual self, and in the second half it includes the cosmic self. So it is like a Mahavakya. Aham Atma, I am the self. Oh Gudakesha. Gudakesha means the Lord of sleep, literally, meaning one who has mastered sleep. Gudaka is sleep, and Isha is one who has mastery, Aishwaryam over it. So there's a story where Arjuna had mastered sleep. He overcame the need to sleep. In this particular context, it is very appropriate because in deep sleep, consciousness is present without any jagat, without any objects, and yet we are happy and content just being with that experience of deep sleep. So Bhagavan is, as it were, hinting at the fact that you really don't need all these objects that you are relying upon. And you get an indication of that in how you never complain about deep sleep. We always say, I slept happily. I did not know anything. Sukham maham asvapsam nakinchid avedisham. I slept very well and I didn't know anything. People say that with satisfaction, not as a complaint. This is an indication Bhagavan Sri Ramana has indicated in so many places that we can look at deep sleep and understand that that happiness is really our own nature. We don't need to seek it from the outside. You get a hint of that from the way you love deep sleep. All human beings are content to sleep well. And so Buddha Kesha, the Lord or one who has mastered deep sleep, is being addressed here. And in the first shlokartha, the first half of the shloka, Lord Krishna says, Sarva Bhutashayasthitaha. I am lodged in the heart of all human beings, all beings really. And Aham Adischa Madhyancha Bhutanam Anta Evacha. I am the beginning, the sustenance, and the end of all living beings. So in the second half of the shloka, Krishna is indicating that that individual soul is non-different, it is non-dual, and it's the same as the cosmic being in which this entire universe has its existence. Bhagavan generally was not very keen to encourage needless argumentation, needless concepts, and the multitude of uh, thought structures in which we lose ourselves. He would always say, come back to yourself, turn your mind inward and stay with Atman. And yet at one place, he gives a very helpful and useful diagram, which I would like to share with you. I shall see if we can share a screen. If not, I will explain it. So that particular diagram has the source of all consciousness coming from within. It is what is mentioned in the self-enquiry book of Bhagavan. So let me see if I can share that. Yes. So here you can see that Bhagavan has indicated that that light which is present and experienced in deep sleep is the source of all existence. The innermost chamber is itself the causal body. The causal body is the one from which this entire universe is projected. And from the causal body, when the deep sleep is broken, this small window, as it were, opens up, and then the light from this innermost source streams out through this portal or doorway, which is called the Mahatattvam. So, to relate it to our own experience, you can think of this as deep sleep with the causal body, and here is just the incipient state where we are just about to go into the dream state. There is a small square here which Bhagavan calls it the ahankara, which is like a mirror. So our eye sense is like a mirror which reflects the consciousness and then projects it into the dream. So this second chamber here represents the dream state. So this is the kshetrajna, this light, and then you have the rest of this entire diagram is the kshetra. So, like I said, first deep sleep, and then the Mahat Tattva, which is the first arising of the individual consciousness, comes. Then there is what is known as Ahankara. Ahankara means the simple sense of I. So there is a small I there, which is then projecting a dream for itself. This chamber is the dream state. And then the number 9 here indicates the gross waking state. All the gross objects are further experienced. So this is what we call Drishti Srishtivada. Drishti Srishtivada, where the entire universe is projected like how you project a hologram. A holographic picture is projected. You just need light and a picture, and you get a three-dimensional image. So that is the way this entire universe is projected for our experience based on our karma. So what is the use of this kind of diagram? Well, it is to help us understand that all that you're experiencing derives its light from you, the source of all consciousness. So you're not just a small being, rather, you're a source of the entire universe's very existence, including that of your own mind. It's not that you're imagining the world, rather, the mind that you are experiencing is part of the imagination. Mind, this body, everything is part of this projection of consciousness. So the help you get is to try and turn the mind inward. You discover that you're not just a small being having this ahankara or the I sense, rather, the I sense, the ahankara resolves as the pure I. This light, which is shaped like the Arunachala Deepam, is the original I, in which our own little I sense resolves in one's understanding. Remember, it's not some magical experience. Instead, it is just to stay with what is true. This whole process is a cognitive process. It's a process of jnana. It's not seeing some special lights and so on, or any kind of vague mystical experiences. Rather, the mind gently resolves in its own source by seeing that all that is projected is not really absolutely real. It is merely my own projection. By that jnana, the mind resolves into pure Sat Chit Ananda. So this diagram is a summary of what Bhagavan was trying to express. And he shares this. This shloka also captures this particular idea. As a summary or takeaway from this particular diagram, you can remember these three aspects, that you have the gross world, and all the gross world is then drawn into yourself and there is the Sukshma Prapancha. After the Sukshma Prapancha, you go still further in self-inquiry. There is what is known as the I thought, the Ahankara. The Ahankara further resolves within as the Sarva Vyapaka. It is the Mahat Tattva. In other words, it is uh, a large or a limitless notion or limitless aspect of that very I. That I is no longer just the I thought, it is the pure I itself. And there the avidya gets destroyed. So when the I thought resolves as pure I by transcending the Mahattattvam and also the avidya or avyakta, that is when the jnana takes place. This is the process of self-knowledge, which is explained by Bhagavan. So in this shloka, Ahamatma Gudakesha, this idea is expressed where the same consciousness is present, Bhagavan declares in all living beings. That is why this is a Mahavakya. That is why Bhagavan has chosen this to represent the summary of the Gita. We will now see the next shloka. Yeah, we have. So the next shloka, Bhagavan expresses the idea that although I am in all living beings, you still are subject to this sorrow, all this fighting. So Bhagavan tells Arjuna that you ought not to grieve, given this highest knowledge that nothing actually is destroyed. What is real is never destroyed. Instead, whatever is born alone is subject to destruction. That is the essence of this next shloka, which we will chant now. Jatasya hi dhruvo mrityuhu dhruvam janma mritasya cha तस्मादपरिहार्येध्ये न त्वं शोचितुमर्हसि जातस्य हि ध्रुवो मृत्युः ध्रुवं जन्ममृतस्य च तस्मादपरिहार्येध्ये न त्वं शोचितुमर्हसि. So the literal first level meaning of that shloka is Jatasya, of anything that is born, Dhruvam, fixed, is Mrityuhu, death. Dhruvam Janma Mritasya cha, and fixed indeed is Janma, again existence, coming into being for that which has died, Mritasya cha. Tasma, therefore, Apariharye Arthe, these processes which are inevitable, unavoidable, which cannot be prevented, apariharye, that which doesn't have a parihara. In these arthe, upon these processes, therefore, nattam shochitumarhasi, you should not grieve, you should not experience shoka. So the word shoka is quite significant here because we have to remember that there is no getting away from discomfort in a regular empirical existence. When there is life, there is always some experience of discomfort. That is not what is being talked about here. Shoka is the overlay upon this discomfort. So in our tradition, based on the context, we have these two words, dukkha and shoka. So dukkha implies discomfort, a situation which you cannot change and where you do not further complicate the situation. Whereas shoka implies our brooding over what cannot be changed. It implies that we are amplifying and brooding and dwelling upon that situation and creating sorrow for oneself. That is known as shoka or sorrow. So here Bhagavan says, Natvam shochitumarhasi. You need not grieve for these processes of birth and death. The idea is that the simple emotion of grief is not denied here. What is denied is brooding over them and constantly dwelling upon them and creating further sorrow for oneself. The mere fact of emotion is not a problem. The emotion comes and it has its own life cycle and it goes. We can see this even in Bhagavan's conversations and life, where Bhagavan never rationalizes or philosophizes another's sorrow. it's very noteworthy that the greatest jnanis never try to dismiss others' pain or sorrow. Instead, they empathize with them. And only when they have assuaged that sorrow to a significant extent, they might teach them something which will be a permanent change in them, giving them a higher perspective. Otherwise, talking Vedanta or talking of a higher reality when another person is subject to sorrow is not what is meant here, and Bhagavan especially would never do that. There's one interesting conversation which I thought I'd share with you. It is with Gurram Subbaramaya, where Gurram Subbaramaya, the great devotee of Bhagavan, who was so free and so loving with Bhagavan, he suffers a bereavement of his child, and then he comes to Bhagavan. I shall read out that little excerpt, which tells us how Bhagavan dealt with the devotee's grief. Guram Subbaramaya's reminiscences contain this. He says, I had suffered bereavement when my 2-year-old son died suddenly. My immediate quest at that time when he comes to the ashram was for peace and solace. I had darshan of Sri Bhagavan in the hall. As our eyes met, there was a miraculous effect on my mind. I felt as if I had plunged into a pool of peace and with my eyes shut, sat in a state of ecstasy for nearly an hour. When I came back to normal consciousness, I made bold to ask him a question. The Gita says that mortals cast off their worn out bodies and acquire new bodies, just as one casts away the worn out clothes and wears new garments. How does this apply to the death of infants whose bodies are new and fresh? Bhagavan, who had already given Guram Subbaramaya so much solace and freedom from that grief, now mentions, how do you know that the body of the dead child was not already worn out? In a deeper sense, the karma there has got completed. Bhagavan says, it may not be apparent, but unless the body is worn out, it will not die. After a gap of 3 years, I again went to the ashram with a note of introduction. And he goes on to say, I now felt as though my dead father had come back alive as Bhagavan. The resemblance was so striking that settled my relationship to Sri Ramana for all time. My approach to him has ever since been that of a child to its parents, quite fearless, free, and familiar. And then on a later visit, he says, on the eve of my departure, I told Bhagavan the suffering of my wife, who was grief stricken by the earlier bereavement. And Bhagavan asked, has she no male child afterwards? Because he had no other male children. He didn't have a female child. Inquired Bhagavan. And I replied, no. Bhagavan sighed and said, alas, what a pity. This took place on October 18th, 1936. My wife delivered a male child the next year on August 1st, 1937. So we can see how Bhagavan empathized with Gurram Subbaramaya without rationalizing his pain. So therefore, there is a very specific context where Vedanta is shared. That's between the Guru and Shishya. After the Shishya's emotion finds some solace and empathy, only then some instruction, some teaching is given. Never in casual conversation. When someone comes to us sharing their grief or their pain, we just empathize. We can be a good listener. Only if they ask, and after a long time, after they've assuaged their emotions, yes, we can share something about Vedanta. But otherwise, it is inappropriate to jump levels, as it's called. There is a Vyavaharika level where grief and emotions are present, and we don't jump and say, oh, all this is just, illusory, all this is unreal. That is never done even by the greatest of jnanis or by even Sri Krishna Bhagavan. So he looks for that appropriate opportunity. Only then this teaching of Vedanta and Advaita is given. So that's a very noteworthy point here. Now we will go to the next shloka. न जायते म्रियते वा कदाचिन् नायं भूत्वा भविता वा न भूयः अजो नित्यः शाश्वतोऽयं पुराणो न हन्यते हन्यमाने शरीरे न जायते म्रियते वा कदाचिन् नायं भूत्वा भविता वा न भूयः अजो नित्यः शाश्वतोऽयं पुराणो न हन्यते हन्यमाने शरीरे. So this shloka incidentally has a different chandas. The earlier shlokas were all in Anushtup. This one is in Trishtup, which is the one which has 11 syllables in each line. So there are 44 syllables. Anushtup has 32. Tune is different. So here Bhagavan Krishna says, Na jayate. This truth or this Atman is never born, na jayate. Mriyate va kadachin. Never does it die. Nayam bhutva bhavita va na bhuyaha. And it's not as if earlier it wasn't existent. Na bhutva bhavita, and now it has come into existence. This is never the case with Atman, with the self. So there was never a time when we were not there and then we came into existence. So this is an important principle which is taken for granted in our Indian darshanas, in most of the Indian darshanas, that nothing ever comes into existence out of vacuum, out of nothingness. So everything has a prior state and from that it comes. In the Western traditions, the idea is of God, quote unquote, has created this universe out of nothing. So in the Eastern, or particularly in the Gita and Vedantic traditions, always there was existence before. Some modification in the form can happen. This is known as Satkaryavada. So you can have clay, which then transforms into a pot and then transforms further into some spoon and so on. The idea being that always there was existence that changes its forms. But you cannot get existence from nothingness. There was never nothingness. Always there was something. This is also a relief because many of us experience a certain grief, for example, when there is a loved one who is lost. Well, Krishna actually assures that they never cease to be. They will continue their journey. And I was actually struck with one particular reference in the Chandogya Upanishad, where the Upanishad says that the jnani has the capacity to even summon all his past associates, his past mothers or fathers or children or spouses or associates. He can just, by his sheer sankalpa shakti, summon or ask them to come and they come before him. So for those who, at least to assuage their grief, have a doubt whether they will ever see their loved ones again, the answer is of course. Although they would have outgrown that need by the time they reach jnana, they would have outgrown that need. But for the record, the Chandogya Upanishad in its last chapter assures, like an Arthavada, like a glorification of this knowledge, that all those whom a person has associated with will come to him if he so wishes. He may not wish it because he feels he is one with everything. So the jnani has that capacity. So this shloka says that the different changes that any entity is subject to are not there for consciousness. Consciousness doesn't change. It is only the reflecting medium, the mind that changes. So to review what we just saw, na jayate mriyate va kadachin, it's neither born nor does it die. Nayam bhutva bhavita vana bhuyaha ajo nitya shashvato ayam purano. Ajaha is unborn, that which is never created afresh. Ajaha, nityaha is a very important word. We will see that again in a subsequent session. It literally means eternal. But it's not just a simple meaning of the word eternal, as in something that is in time but continues forever in time. It's not like that. Eternal is beyond even the notion of time. It is a priori. before even time arises. As an experienced consciousness is. Consciousness is a priori before even time arises. That is the word nityaha. Ajo nityaha. Shashvataha. Shashvataha means constant. It is always there without any decay. Ajo nitya shashvato ayam puranaha. Puranaha. We use this word even in conventional parlance to say something which is very old. But Shankara says, interestingly, Puranaha is Pura api Navam bhavati. Pura is old, Navam is new. So that which is Puranaha is old at the same time ever new, ever fresh. So it is ever fresh at the same time it's old. So it's not just something that is old and decaying. So this Atman is that way ever old and yet ever fresh, ever new. Puranaha Nahanyate hanyamane sharire. So even if this sharira, this body is destroyed, that is not destroyed. So these few words are very carefully explained by Sri Shankara by saying that any entity has six bhava vikaras. So any entity you know or we experience, any object, including even the subtle entities like mind, they have six transformations, six changes they are subject to. They are known as six bhava vikaras. Bhava means process, vikara is transformation. So transformative processes. So what are they? They are asti. Sorry, they are jayate. So they are first born. Something is created. Like let's say an animal is born first. That is known as jayate. It is born. Once it is born, it might, God forbid, become stillborn. Like some of the animals, they are not able to survive in spite of taking, birth and separating from their mother's body. Not so. The second change is called asti. It exists. It continues its existence. So the first is jayate, birth. Second is asti, continued existence. The third is called vardhate, is growth. Growth is it continues to add on to its weight. And then we have the fourth change, which is called viparinamate. It transforms. Viparinamate is to transform. Then you have apakshiyate, it decays, and mriyate, it dies. So these six transformations are not there for Atma. That is the summary of this shloka. So we will look into further details of this shloka and subsequent shlokas in the next session. We will end with the Shanti mantra. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Shri Guru Pyo Namaha Hari Om. You're welcome to ask any questions or share anything related to this topic. One of the things that was asked in the last session was about how consciousness is there even in a stone. I had partially answered that question asked by someone last time by saying that there is an amsha matra, there is a partial manifestation of consciousness. The very existence of any entity is that manifestation of consciousness. So in stones, the very fact that the stone exists is that consciousness there which is evident to you or me. Similarly, there was a question on the law of entropy. So entropy, I already mentioned that. The idea is that consciousness is not subject to disorder. It is like how in a dream, we experience so many changes in the dream, we wake up unchanged. This is very significant that no matter how many changes we experience in a dream, we wake up the same person. That's a relief, especially if the dream is unpleasant. So, consciousness is like that. No matter what happens, even in the waking state, we are the same, pure, unsullied by all that happens. That is the idea of entropy not affecting consciousness. Okay, if there are no further questions, we will end this session today. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you. Anuragji, please take over.
Raghavji, thank you so much for a very knowledgeable session, and it was again an honor to have you with us. May I please request Jayanti ji to share Akshar Manamalai with the team.
Om Namo Ramana. Taruna Runamani Kidanavali Nigataru Makshara Manamagimadi Tirnadiya Tirithiriya Tirmaganam Varavadal Purulada Karuna Karamuni Ramanariyan Uvagainal Soliya Jatiyaga அருணாச்சலமென அகமே அறிவுடுமாழ்வார் சிவனுலகாழ்வாரே அருணாச்சலவரற்கு ஏற்ற அக்ஷரமண மாலை சாற்ற கருணாகர கணபதியே கரம் அருளி காப்பாய் அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல அருணாச்சலமென அகமே நினைப்பவரகத்தை விரருபாய் அருணாச்சலா அழகு சுந்தரம் போலகமும் நீயும் முத்து அபிநமாயிருப்போம் அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அகம் புகுந்தி துணக குகை சிறையாய் அமர்வித்ததென் கொல்லருணாச்சலா ஆறு காயனை ஆண்டனை அகற்றிடுல கிளம் பழித்திடும் அருணாச்சலா இப்பழி தப்புனையே நினைப்பேத்தாய் இனி யார் விடுவார் அருணாச்சலா ஈந்திடும் அன்னையின் பெரிதருள் பொறிவோ இதுவோ உனதருள் அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா உனையே மாற்றி ஓடாதுள்ளத்தின் உறுதியாயிருப்பாய் அருணாச்சலா ஊசுளம் விடாதுனை கண்டடங்கிடவுன் அழகை காட்டருணாச்சலா என்னை அழித்தி போதெனை கள்ளவா விடில் இதுவோ வாழ்மை அருணாச்சலா ஏன் இந்த உறக்கம் என்னை பிறரிழுக்க இது உனக்கழவோ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா ஐம்புல கழ்வர் அகத்தில் போகும்போது அகத்தில் நீ இளையோ அருணாச்சலா ஒருவன முன்னை ஒளி சேவர் வருவார் உன் சோதே இது அருணாச்சலா ஓம்கார பொருள் ஒப்புயர்வில்லோய் உனையாரறிவார் அருணாச்சல அவ்வை போலென கொன்னருளை தந்தனை ஆளுவதும் கடன் அருணாச்சல அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல அருணாச்சலம் வாழி அன்பர்களும் வாழி அக்ஷரமண மாலை வாழி வாழ்க ஸ்வயம் பிரகாச வாழ்க வாழ்கவே சூழ்க சூதாத்ம சக்தி சூழ்க சூழ்கவே வாழ்க ஸ்வயம் பிரகாச வாழ்க வாழ்கவே சூழ்க சூதாத்ம சக்தி சூழ்க சூழ்கவே ஏழுலகம் ஜீவன் முக்தி இன்பம் பொங்கவே ஏழுலகம் ஜீவன் முக்தி இன்பம் பொங்கவே இதயம் இறைவனாகி எல்லாம் ஓங்கவே இதயமாகும் இறைவனாகி எல்லாம் ஓங்கவே பாழ்மனம் மகந்தை வாழ்வு பாழ்பட்டொழிகவே பாழ்மனம் மகந்தை வாழ்வு பாழ்பட்டொழிகவே பரமசச்சிதானந்தாத்மா பால் பொழிகவே பரமசச்சிதானந்தாத்மா பால் பொழிகவே வாழ்க ஸ்வயம் பிரகாஷ வாழ்க வாழ்கவே சூழ்க சுதாத்ம சக்தி சூழ்க சூழ்கவே தட்டிலாத நித்திய ஜீவ தத்துவமோங்கவே தட்டிலாத நித்திய ஜீவ தத்துவமோங்கவே தன்மயத்தில் சின்மயம் தழைத்து ஓங்கவே தன்மயத்தில் சின்மயம் தழைத்து ஓங்கவே எட்டு திக்குமம் சசோகம் எதிரொலிக்கவே எட்டு திக்குமம் சசோகம் எதிரொலிக்கவே எல்லாம் பிரம்மம் என்னும் உண்மையை வகிக்கவே எல்லாம் பிரம்மம் என்னும் உண்மையை வகிக்கவே வாழ்க ஸ்வயம் பிரகாச வாழ்க வாழ்கவே சூழ்க சூதாத்ம சக்தி சூழ்க சூழ்கவே வாழ்க வாழ்கவே.
Jayanti ji, thank you. Narayan ji?
Yes, sir. स्वाहा ओम भगवान स्वाहा ओम ज्ञानाय स्वाहा ओम दानाय स्वाहा ओम समानाय स्वाहा ओम ब्रह्मणे स्वाहा अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः प्रणत गोती रमणे विद्यम समर्पयामि मध्ये मध्ये भानियं समर्पयामि अमृतोत्तम समर्पयामि नीराजनं समर्पयामि नीराजनानन्तरम् आस्मदीयं समर्पयामि पूगी बल समायतम नागवली तरे उदम कर्पूर्ण सूर्ण समुद्रम प्रदीप्ताम कर्पूर नीलाधरम नमः वर्षिते समर्पयामि नीराजनं समर्पयामि नीराजनानन्तरमात्मन्यं समर्पयामि शोभां पुष्पं वेद पुष्पवान् भजावान् पुष्पवान् नोति चन्द्रमा भावां पुष्पं पुष्पवान् भजावान् पुष्पवान् नोति ॐ तत् ब्रह्मा ॐ तत् वायु ॐ तत् आत्मा ॐ तत् सत्यम् ॐ तत् सर्वम् ॐ तत् गुरो नमः अन्धचरभूते स भुवायां पुष्पं ॐ धर्मस्तम्भसत्कारं धर्मस्तम्भुद्रस्तम् ॐ तथा कर्मणां प्रजयातने विद्यानयके अमृतत्वमानसो परेणनाः नूतं भुवायं विद्यालतेजो विसन्ति वेदान्तज्ञानसे नित्यदाता संन्यासयोगादभिसत्त्वाः हे ब्रह्मलोके परान्तकाले परान्तकात् परिमुच्यन्ते सर्वे तारं विभावं परमे यत्पुण्डरीकं पुरमस्य धर्मसदं तत्रागन्तकर्म विशोभं तद्विद्यनं तद्वादित्यं यो वेदादो स्वरूपो वेदान्तस्य प्रतिष्ठः तस्य प्रकृतिनस्य परमैश्वरः मन्त्रपुष्पं ब्रह्ममर्षति समर्पयामि ॐ तत्सद्ब्रह्मार्पणमस्तु हरि ओम् हरि ओम् हरि ओम् हरि ओम् हरि ओम् हरि ओम हरि ओम हरि ओम हरि ओम ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल रमणाय ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल रमणाय ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल रमणाय ओम नमः शिवाय नमः ओम नमः शिवाय नमः ओम नमः शिवाय नमः ओम शिवाय नमः ओम शिवाय नमः ओम शिवाय नमः ओम पार्वतीये नमः ओम पार्वतीये नमः ओम पार्वतीये नमः अरुणाचल रमणा
Namo Ramana. This brings us to the closure of today's satsang. We shall reconvene on Wednesday, the 1st of September, for the Advent Day. The details have already been shared with all the devotees. I shall resend them again tomorrow. Namo Ramana.